In 1888, a Smithsonian researcher named James Mooney arrived in the mountains of North Carolina with a simple goal. He wanted to record what remained of the old Cherokee world before it disappeared. Instead, he came back with one of the strangest conversations ever written down in American anthropology. The Cherokee told him that the enormous earth structures scattered across their homeland were older than their own people. They said they had inherited them, used them, protected them, but never built them. Then they told him something even stranger. Deep inside the oldest of these structures, they said, an ancient fire was still burning beneath the earth. Some elders pointed to smoke reportedly seen rising from one of the mounds during the Civil War as proof that it had never gone out. Mooney wrote the account down in his notebooks. Those notebooks still exist. The mound still exists. And more than 130 years later, the largest one remains exactly as he found it, unopened. Tonight, we're examining what the Cherokee actually told James Mooney in the years around 1888, why they believed these places stood long before their ancestors arrived, and why some of them insisted that something beneath those mounds was still alive enough to keep a fire burning. To understand why the Cherokee stories recorded in 1888 still unsettle people today, you have to start with the man who wrote them down. His name was James Mooney. He was 27 years old, largely self-taught and working for the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology when he arrived in the mountains of western North Carolina in the summer of 1888. America at that time was changing quickly. Railroads were expanding. Towns were growing. And across much of the country there was a growing belief that native traditions would soon disappear entirely. Mooney had heard the same thing everyone else had heard, that the old stories were dying. The old ceremonies were disappearing, the old language was fading. He came to the mountains hoping to save what remained before it was too late. What he walked into instead was a world that had survived far longer than anyone expected. Because the Cherokee families living in those mountains were not there by accident. 50 years earlier, in 1838, the United States government forced thousands of Cherokee men, women and children from their homes and marched them west toward Oklahoma. The journey would become known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died before reaching their destination. But not everyone left. Some families disappeared into the mountains. Some hid in valleys soldiers never reached. Others found ways to remain quietly on pieces of land their ancestors had lived on for generations. The people Mooney met in 1888 were their children and grandchildren, and many of them believed something important was about to disappear forever. Not the people, the memory, the names of places, the old formulas, the stories attached to rivers and mountains, the meaning behind ceremonies that younger generations were beginning to leave behind. Mooney understood something that many researchers of his time did not. You cannot preserve a culture by studying artifacts alone. You have to listen to the people who still carry it. That approach opened doors that had remained closed to outsiders for generations. One of those doors belonged to an older medicine keeper known as Swimmer. To most visitors, Swimmer looked like an elderly man living quietly in a remote mountain community. Mooney saw something entirely different. He saw one of the last living people carrying centuries of memory inside his head. Swimmer knew the old stories, the old ceremonies, the old healing formulas. He understood places that appeared ordinary to outsiders but carried meanings that reached back further than anyone could remember. Over time, the two men developed a friendship that would eventually produce one of the most important records ever created about Cherokee tradition. Because Swimmer was not simply telling stories, he was preserving a world, and hidden inside that world was a claim so unusual that even Mooney never forgot it. The Cherokee told him that the great earthen structures scattered across their homeland did not belong to them. The mounds were older, the mounds were inherited, and according to some of the elders, before something important was still waiting inside them. If you enjoy documentaries built from original records, forgotten interviews, and traditions preserved long before modern historians arrived, consider subscribing. Some of the most extraordinary stories in history survive because one person arrived just in time to write them down. The longer James Mooney stayed with the Cherokee, the stranger the picture became. He had arrived expecting stories. Instead, he found records. The Cherokee were not relying entirely on memory. Some of their medicine keepers had written parts of their knowledge down, not in English, in Cherokee. This surprised almost everyone outside the nation. Earlier in the century, a Cherokee man named Sequoyah had created an entire writing system for his language completely on his own. Within a few years, Cherokee communities were printing newspapers and books in their own script. Some medicine keepers quietly used that same writing system for something else. They began recording prayers, healing formulas, ceremonies, instructions that had previously existed only in memory. These notebooks were never meant for outsiders. They were working manuals used by the people responsible for preserving the old traditions. Most remained hidden. A few survived, and eventually one of them reached James Mooney. The man who shared it with him was an elder and medicine keeper known as Swimmer. Mooney would later describe him as one of the most important sources he ever worked with. Swimmer carried stories, formulas, and traditions that stretched back through generations. Some of them had never been written down before. Others existed only in those private Cherokee notebooks. Then Mooney began noticing something unusual. The same places kept appearing again and again. The rivers, the springs, the old town sites, and above all else, the mounds, the great earthen structures scattered across the valleys and river bottoms of the southern Appalachians. Again and again the Cherokee returned to them. Ceremonies happened there. Meetings happened there. Healing happened there. The mounds were not ruins standing outside Cherokee life. They sat directly at its center, and according to the elders speaking with Mooney, that had been true long before the Cherokee themselves arrived, because the mounds, they insisted, were already ancient when their ancestors first came among them. The Cherokee did not claim them as creations, they claimed them as inheritances. And according to some of the oldest traditions, something else had been inherited as well, a fire, one that had supposedly never gone out. That was the moment the story stopped being archaeology and became something far stranger. The deeper James Mooney went into Cherokee tradition, the more often he encountered the same structures. The mounds, they appeared in stories, they appeared in ceremonies, they appeared in healing rituals, and they appeared in conversations about places that the Cherokee considered sacred. Today, many people drive past these structures without even realizing what they are looking at. A grassy hill beside a road, a raised platform in the middle of a town, an unusual shape in an open field. But to the Cherokee, these were not hills, they were centers, places where the most important moments in community life happened. Council meetings were held there, ceremonies took place there, important decisions were made there, and according to the people speaking to Mooney in the late 19th century, healing itself was deeply connected to these places. The most famous of these sites was Niquosi. The mound still stands today in Franklin, North Carolina. Cars drive past it every day. Shops stand nearby. Most people barely notice it. But Niquosi was not simply another settlement mound. To the Cherokee, it was one of the sacred centers of their world. What makes the story remarkable is not what the Cherokee said about the mound. It is what they refused to say. They never claimed to have built it, not once. Again and again, Mooney recorded the same explanation. The mounds were already there. The Cherokee inherited them, protected them, used them. But the builders belonged to an earlier time. That point often surprises modern audiences, because archaeology eventually reached the same conclusion. The great mound-building cultures of eastern North America existed centuries before Europeans arrived, and long before the historical Cherokee appeared in these mountains. On this point, the oral tradition and the archaeological evidence unexpectedly meet in the middle. But the Cherokee stories went further. According to the traditions Mooney recorded, these structures were not simply old construction projects left behind by forgotten people. They remained active places, living places. The center of that belief was fire. Inside the largest mounds, the Cherokee said an everlasting fire burned beneath the earth. This was not the fire used for cooking meals or heating homes. It was the sacred town fire, the heart of the community. Once every year during the green corn ceremony, families extinguished the fires in their own homes. The old year ended, the ashes were cleared away. Then a new fire was carried outward from the sacred flame and distributed throughout the settlement. Every household began again using the same source. One community, one fire, one beginning. According to Swimmer and other elders speaking to Mooney, the oldest and strongest of these fires existed beneath the oldest mounds, especially places like Nikwasi and Kituwa. Some believed those fires had burned for generations beyond memory. Others believed they had never truly gone out at all. Then came the story that caught Mooney's attention more than any other. During the Civil War, Cherokee soldiers camping near one of the ancient mound sites reportedly claimed they had seen smoke rising from the earth itself, not from a chimney, not from a campfire, from the mound. For the people telling the story, the explanation was obvious. The fire was still alive, the same fire their ancestors had protected for generations, the same fire that had survived war, removal, and the destruction of the old towns above it. Whether we interpret that account literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, almost misses the point, because the Cherokee were making a much larger claim. These places were not ruins. Ruins belong to the past. The mounds belong to the present. The ceremonies still happened there. The stories still lived there. And according to some of the oldest traditions, something else was still there too. Something connected to the people the Cherokee called the Nunahai, the immortals, the people who lived beneath the mountains. And according to the stories recorded in 1888, they had been there long before the first Cherokee arrived. Of all the stories James Mooney recorded in the mountains of North Carolina, one stayed with him more than any other. It was not the stories of invisible people. It was not the stories of hidden towns inside mountains. It was the fire, because the Cherokee insisted on something very specific. The sacred fire inside the great mounds had never been allowed to die. For generations, every town protected it. Every ceremony revolved around it. Every year, during the green corn ceremony, families extinguished the fires inside their homes and relit them from a single source. One flame, one community, one beginning. The fire was more than heat. It was continuity. As long as it burned, the town itself remained alive. And according to the elders speaking with Mooney in 1888, the strongest fires belonged to the oldest mounds, especially places like Nikwasi and Kituwa. These were not ordinary places in Cherokee memory. Kituwa was the mother town, the place many Cherokee considered the beginning of their nation. Some traditions described it as the center of the world itself. Nikwasi held a similar importance. Long after the towns around them changed or disappeared, the mounds remained, watching, waiting. Then came the detail that transformed an old tradition into something much stranger. Swimmer told Mooney that the fire beneath some of these mounds was still burning, not symbolically, literally. He pointed to stories from the Civil War in which Cherokee soldiers camped near one of the ancient sites reported seeing smoke rising from the mound itself. Smoke from beneath the earth. Smoke from a fire nobody remembered lighting. For the people telling the story, there was no mystery. The fire had never gone out. It had survived wars, it had survived removals, it had survived the destruction of the old towns above it, because the fire belonged to something older than the towns themselves. And that brings us back to the question that sat at the center of everything Mooney was hearing. Who lit it? Because the Cherokee repeatedly told him the same thing. They had inherited the mounds, they protected them. They used them, they built their ceremonies around them, but they did not build them. The structures belonged to the people who came before. Modern archaeology would eventually reach almost the same conclusion. The great mound builders of the southeast belonged to an earlier civilization that had already faded from the landscape centuries before Europeans arrived. On that point, the archaeology and the oral tradition stand remarkably close together. The disagreement begins only after that. Archaeology says the story ended there. The Cherokee said it didn't. Because according to the traditions recorded in 1888, the builders may have disappeared, but the fire never did. And perhaps that is why these places continue to hold such power over the imagination, not because they are ruins. Ruins belong to the past. The Cherokee remembered these places differently, as living places, as healing places, as places where something important had been entrusted to later generations to protect rather than explain. More than a century after James Mooney filled his notebooks in the Smoky Mountains, the mound at Nikwasi still stands. It remains unopened, unexcavated, and whatever rests beneath it today remains exactly where it was left. Which leaves us with one final question. If a fire really was passed from one people to another across centuries, what exactly was being kept alive?